Hello, dear listeners of X Science Fiction Stories. We deeply appreciate your support. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our staff. If you enjoy the story today, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can keep creating these adventures. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments of this video. The galaxy had always operated on a simple rule: the strong devour the weak. When the alien armada dropped out of hyperspace to corner a solitary human engineering ship, they expected a swift surrender. They anticipated fear. What they did not anticipate was a lone engineer deciding that, if he was going to die, he would take the laws of physics down with him. The Aegis was not a warship. It was a lumbering mobile terraforming station, drifting through the absolute silence of the outer rim. Out here, billions of miles from the nearest military outpost. The darkness was absolute. Inside the main control deck, bathed in the amber glow of the monitors, Chief Engineer Asher Baird stood watching a dead world breathe. For the past 72 hours, he had been meticulously adjusting the gravitational core manipulator. Below the ship, a barren asteroid the size of a small moon was slowly cracking open, its crust fractured under the sheer force of the artificial gravity well Asher was generating. He was reshaping stone and ice, preparing the foundation for an atmospheric envelope. The isolation was profound, wrapping around the station like a shroud, making the gentle hum of the servers sound like a heartbeat, echoing in an empty tomb. That fragile piece was shattered in an instant. Space itself simply ruptured, bleeding violent violet light as four massive silhouettes ripped their way out of a spatial jump. The kinetic shockwave of their arrival slammed into the Aegis, sending violent tremors through the titanium hull plates. Asher gripped the primary console as his coffee mug shattered on the metal deck. On the main tactical screen, four glaring red icons materialized, boxing the Aegis in from every vector. They were Kalan dreadnoughts. They were angular monstrosities of black metal and glowing plasma drives, bristles of heavy cannons locking onto his unarmed vessel. The sheer scale of the enemy ships dwarfed the human station, turning the vast emptiness of space into a suffocating cage. The communication console shrieked, overriding Asher and his terraforming data with an incoming transmission. The screen flickered, replacing the image of the asteroid with the reptilian, scaled visage of a Kalan commander. The eyes of the alien were twin slits of cold gold. "Human vessel Aegis," the commander hissed, his voice translating through the ship software in a flat metallic drone. "You are surrounded by the Vanguard fleet. Power down your engines. Relinquish control of your gravitational core technology immediately. Compliance guarantees a painless execution. Resistance guarantees your station will be reduced to atomic dust. You have exactly 1 minute." The screen abruptly cut to black. A timer appeared, displaying 60 seconds, ticking down in glaring red numerals. Asher stood frozen. The claustrophobia of the situation crashed down on him. The air in the control room suddenly felt impossibly thick. He glanced frantically at the evacuation protocols. It was useless. The escape pods were far too slow. The Kalan point defense lasers would vaporize them a millisecond after they cleared the launch tubes. The Aegis had absolutely zero firepower. It possessed no energy shields and no railguns. It only had thick armor plating meant to deflect stray micrometeoroids, not military-grade plasma batteries. He was a dead man standing in a flying coffin. 50 seconds remained. The silence returned, far more suffocating than before. The only sound was his frantic breathing and the low thrum of the gravitational core deep in the bowels of the ship. Asher stared intently at the radar display. 4 massive warships hovered dangerously close to ensure the human ship could not slip away into the dark. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the timer dropped to 40 seconds. The panic in his chest began to crystallize into a cold resolve born of absolute desperation. Asher shifted his gaze from the tactical display back to the terraforming diagnostic screen. The massive gravitational core at the heart of his ship was currently operating at 20% capacity. A terrifying clarity suddenly washed over his mind. He was a scientist, not a soldier. But the brutal truth was that the universe did not care about his profession. Physics did not care about uniforms or military ranks. Physics only cared about raw force. As the timer hit 30 seconds, Asher reached toward the master control panel. His fingers hovered over the crimson safety overrides designed to prevent the core from tearing the ship apart. He took one final deep breath. He was about to commit an act so fundamentally reckless, it violated every single safety regulation ever written in the history of human space exploration. He held the leash to a captive black hole, and he was ready to let it off the chain. The timer on the main display hit 20 seconds. Asher slammed his palm onto the manual override panel. A blaring klaxon ripped through the control room, followed immediately by the cold, synthetic voice of the station artificial intelligence. Warning: gravitational core safety restraints have been disabled. Structural failure probability is 99%. Please re-engage safety protocols. Mute alarms, Asher commanded, his voice trembling but his hands moving with frantic precision across the holographic interface. He was not going to surrender, and running was physically impossible. Instead, he seized manual control of the tectonic manipulation drill. Normally, this massive array of focusing rings at the belly of the ship was designed to fire controlled pulses of localized gravity to crack planetary crusts. It was a tool of creation. Asher was about to turn it into an instrument of cosmic horror. With 10 seconds left on the enemy countdown, he dragged the targeting reticle away from the icy asteroid below them. He hauled the massive crosshairs upward, locking the coordinates directly into the dead center of the 4 Kalan dreadnoughts surrounding him. The enemy formation was tight, arrogant, and perfectly positioned for what was about to happen. Rerouting all auxiliary power to the main tectonic array, Asher muttered to himself, killing life support to the lower decks, shutting down the primary communication arrays, and draining the reserve batteries. The lights in the command center flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the angry red glow of the tactical screens. Fire! He engaged the primary ignition. Deep within the engineering bay, the captive gravitational core roared. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of his bones. The Aegis lurched violently. From the lower array, a beam of concentrated, unstable gravitational force lashed out. It was not a laser. It was not plasma. It was pure, unadulterated mass projected into a single point in the vacuum of space. When the beam struck the empty coordinates between the Kalan warships, reality simply could not process the localized density. The fabric of physics folded, buckled, and tore. A micro-quantum singularity ripped open. It was an absolute void, a puncture wound in the canvas of the universe. The immediate effect was catastrophic and utterly silent. The localized tear defied the laws of thermodynamics, instantly sucking all ambient thermal energy from the surrounding area. The temperature in the quadrant plummeted to absolute zero in a fraction of a second. Across the Kalan fleet, navigation arrays, targeting sensors, and plasma conduits froze solid. Frost bloomed in geometric patterns across the black armored hulls of the dreadnoughts, as their internal heat was violently leached into the void. Aboard the Kalan command ship, panic erupted. The reptilian commander shrieked orders to his gunnery crews, realizing too late that the human was not fighting back with conventional weapons. He was weaponizing the cosmos itself. "Open fire! Obliterate them!" the commander roared, his previous cold arrogance evaporating into primal terror. Heavy plasma batteries and high-frequency laser cannons on the flagship ignited, unleashing a torrential barrage of destructive energy aimed directly at the Aegis. But the laws of optics had already broken down. As the lethal beams of concentrated light and superheated plasma crossed the threshold of the singularity, they contorted. Asher watched in awestruck silence as the blinding streams of enemy fire bent into unnatural arcs, curving wildly off their trajectories before being swallowed whole by the gaping maw of the gravitational tear. The Kalan were feeding the anomaly, adding raw energy to an already critical mass. The singularity reached its absolute saturation point. It could no longer sustain the paradox of its own existence. The tear violently collapsed in on itself and detonated. It was not an explosion of fire or debris, but a pure spatial shockwave. A tidal wave of expanding gravity that warped the stars in the background into chaotic smears of light. The shockwave hit the Kalan Vanguard fleet with the force of a dying star. 3 of the massive black dreadnoughts were caught in the epicenter. There was no resistance. Their energy shields shattered like brittle glass. Millions of tons of reinforced titanium alloy groaned and crumpled. In the span of 2 heartbeats, the 3 majestic warships were compressed, twisted, and pulverized into compressed balls of unrecognizable space junk. The sheer kinetic force liquefied the crews inside before they could even register the hull breaches. The Aegis, however, was already moving. Seconds before the detonation, Asher had inverted the magnetic field of the terraforming array, syncing the frequency of his ship to the repulsive wave of the collapsing tear. As the spatial tsunami radiated outward, it slammed into the Aegis, but instead of crushing the station, the synchronized magnetic bubble caught the kinetic force. The human ship surfed the wave of gravitational destruction. Metal screamed, bulkheads ruptured, and Asher was thrown violently to the floor as the acceleration forces threatened to crush his chest. But the Aegis held together. It was violently catapulted out of the blockade, hurtling away into the deep dark at speeds its engines could never have achieved. Behind him, the spatial distortion slowly settled, leaving behind a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen debris. The sole surviving Kalan warship, the command vessel, drifted powerlessly on the edge of the blast radius, its systems dead and its crew paralyzed by a profound, suffocating horror. The Vanguard fleet had been broken not by a superior military force, but by a lone engineer who dared to break the universe to stay alive. The telemetry data from the crippled Kalan command ship bled into the interstellar communication network like ink through water. It was intercepted by neutral automated listening posts drifting along the trade routes and was immediately decrypted. Within 48 hours, the raw and unfiltered recording of the spatial anomaly detonating the Vanguard fleet was echoing across the secure channels of every major civilization in the galaxy. It was analyzed, dissected, and replayed billions of times by alien intelligence agencies. The neutral intelligence stations operated by the synthetic minds of the Outer Rim spent exactly 12 seconds analyzing the footage before classifying humanity as a supreme, unpredictable threat. The telemetry revealed that the human engineer had bypassed 99 safety protocols simultaneously. The sheer mathematical improbability of surviving the resulting singularity shockwave meant the human had either calculated the exact magnetic resonance required to surf the wave in less than 20 seconds, or he had simply acted on blind and suicidal instinct. Neither option was comforting to the galactic community. In the obsidian chambers of the Kalan High Command, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. The Grand Admirals, veterans of 100 orbital campaigns, watched the holographic projection of the anomaly swallowing their prized dreadnoughts. They stood in rigid silence, their scales flushed with the deep crimson of humiliation and fury. They were completely baffled. Across 10,000 years of recorded galactic history, there were established paradigms of warfare. You aimed your cannons, you overpowered the shields of your enemy, and you destroyed their hull. They understood strategy. They understood attrition. They did not understand an enemy who treated the fabric of reality like a disposable grenade. Using environmental terraforming equipment to rip a hole in the fabric of space was an act of profound insanity. The risk of cascading quantum failure was so extreme that it could have easily consumed the human ship along with the entire asteroid belt. No sane species had ever dared to weaponize a planetary core drill. But as the intelligence reports flooded in, a chilling realization settled over the observing races. Humanity did not play by the traditional rules of engagement. When backed into a corner, they did not calculate the odds of survival based on their armor or their firepower. They simply discarded the fundamental laws of physics to seize a chance at life. To the ancient and refined empires of the cosmos, this was not bravery. It was a terrifying and feral unpredictability. In the dimly lit diplomatic halls of the Central Galactic Hub, ambassadors convened in emergency closed-door sessions. A new phrase began to circulate among the elite intelligence networks, a label explicitly created to describe the human paradox. They called it the doctrine of absolute ruin. It defined a species that possessed the psychological capacity to weaponize literally anything, including the very architecture of reality. The humans were no longer viewed as primitive newcomers confined to the Orion Arm. They were suddenly perceived as a profound existential threat, a race of engineers who would gladly strike a match in a room filled with volatile gas just to burn the person standing next to them. For the Kalan Empire, the destruction of the Vanguard fleet was a devastating blow to their prestige. The galaxy operated on fear and the perception of invincibility. If the lesser races believed that a single, unarmed human terraforming vessel could annihilate 3 top-tier dreadnoughts, the entire Kalan hegemony would collapse into rebellion. To protect their absolute dominion and restore their tarnished honor, the Kalan Supreme Council made a unanimous and brutal decision. A localized skirmish was no longer sufficient. Orders were dispatched to the deepest shipyards of their empire. They mobilized the Purge Armada, a colossal fleet of thousands of heavily armored siege engines and planet-killer ships. Their destination was the Orion Rim. The strategic objective was uncompromisingly simple. They were to isolate the entire human territory, sever all hyperspace trade routes, and systematically eradicate every single human stronghold, outpost, and colony ship in the sector. Before the Armada broke atmosphere, the Kalan Intelligence Network broadcasted a final and unencrypted diplomatic transmission directly to the Global Council on Earth. The message was not an invitation to negotiate. It was an absolute ultimatum delivered with cold and calculating precision. People of Earth. The Kalan transmission echoed through the chambers of the human leadership, the voice synthesized to be devoid of all emotion. Your vessel, the Aegis, has committed an act of unprecedented spatial terrorism against the sovereign forces of the Kalan Empire. You have proven yourselves to be a danger to the physical stability of the galactic arm. We demand the immediate and unconditional surrender of the engineer known as Asher Baird. He is to be handed over to our custody for public execution. In addition, you will dismantle all planetary engineering technologies within 72 hours. If you comply, your species will be allowed to remain confined to your home system under permanent blockade. If you refuse, the Purge Armada will incinerate your worlds until your entire civilization is nothing more than a footnote in our archives. When the Global Council broadcasted the Kalan ultimatum across the 52 colonial sectors, they braced for absolute anarchy. Sociologists had predicted mass hysteria, religious cults predicting the end of days, and chaotic riots tearing through the megacities of Earth and Mars. Instead, a chilling, unified silence descended over the human race. It was not the silence of submission. It was the quiet, predatory stillness of a cornered animal realizing that the only way out is through the teeth of the predator. There were no public demonstrations demanding peace, and no desperate politicians begging for a treaty. The threat of total biological annihilation simply burned away all trivial divisions, leaving behind a cold, collective stubbornness. Within 24 hours of the alien transmission, every civilian orbital facility, deep space refinery, and corporate shipyard ceased their daily operations. The massive automated construction yards orbiting Saturn halted the assembly of luxury starliners and bulk freighters. Under a system-wide communication blackout, they initiated a desperate and illegal retrofit. They were not attempting to construct military dreadnoughts because they lacked the armor plating and the plasma technology. Instead, the engineers analyzed the telemetry from the Aegis and began mass-producing the exact same gravitational core that Asher Baird had weaponized. Only this time, they intentionally designed the cores to be critically flawed. They stripped out the containment fields, removed the thermal regulators, and wired the ignition systems to manual deadman switches. They were building thousands of unstable gravity bombs wrapped in the shells of commercial transports. The call to arms was never televised. There were no patriotic recruitment posters, no soaring orchestral anthems, and no charismatic generals barking inspiring speeches over the planetary feeds. The mobilization of the human defense force happened in the shadows. Encrypted coordinates were quietly pinged to the datapads of independent asteroid miners, salvage crew captains, and frontier technicians. These were calloused men and women who had spent their entire lives wrestling with the brutal indifference of the cosmos. They had zero combat training. They did not know standard fleet formations or naval combat doctrines. They only knew how to crack open planets and survive in the crushing dark. Across hundreds of grease-stained cantinas and dimly lit docking bays, a silent draft took place. Ordinary civilians sat across from each other at rusted metal tables, passing around digital conscription contracts. These documents offered no hazard pay, no pension plans, and explicitly stated a survival probability of less than 1%. Without a word of complaint or hesitation, mechanics, cargo haulers, and ice miners pressed their thumbprints to the glass screens. They signed their own death warrants in absolute silence, trading their futures for the survival of their species. The Earth Council possessed no military admirals experienced in interstellar fleet combat, so they officially gave the command to the only human who had ever successfully destroyed a Kalan warship. Asher Baird stood on the reinforced bridge of the patched-together Aegis, looking out at the tactical display as his new forces arrived at the rallying point. It was the most pathetic, absurd, and terrifying armada ever assembled in the history of the Orion sector. Over 4,000 mismatched civilian vessels drifted in the void. There were colossal industrial rock breakers with reinforced boring drills, long-haul energy tugs carrying volatile hydrogen tanks, and atmospheric harvesters retrofitted with heavy mining lasers wired to overheat. Their hulls were painted in 100 different corporate logos, scarred by decades of micrometeorite impacts. It was a junkyard fleet, a desperate militia of the working class. All civilian captains. This is Fleet Command. Asher broadcasted over the encrypted, localized channel, his voice steady and devoid of any false heroism. Cut all non-essential power. Bleed your thermal exhausts. We are going dark, operating under total radio silence. The Patchwork Armada engaged their civilian jump drives and slipped out of the human border zones. They did not move to intercept the Kalan Purge Armada in open space. Instead, Asher led his 4,000 junk ships deep into the Nebra expanse. Nebra was a massive dead nebula, a cosmic graveyard choking on dense metallic dust clouds and the frozen remnants of extinguished stars. The heavy particle interference rendered traditional alien targeting sensors completely blind. As the human fleet penetrated the thick, swirling violet clouds of the nebula, they anchored themselves to drifting chunks of stellar debris. They arranged their mining vessels into a colossal, meticulously calculated sphere, spanning thousands of miles across the dead zone. They killed their primary engines and dropped their life support heaters to just above freezing to mask their thermal signatures. Sitting in the suffocating, pitch-black silence of the dead nebula, thousands of human workers placed their hands over their rigged gravitational cores. They simply waited in the dark, ready to spring a trap on the most feared military force in the universe. Deep within the swirling, bruised purple and toxic green dust clouds of the Nebra expanse, the Kalan Purge Armada arrived to exact their promised genocide. They did not attempt to sneak into the sector. They announced their presence with the deafening, physical tearing of space-time, as 10,000 heavy warships synchronized their hyperdrives and breached the nebula barrier at the exact same moment. It was a flawless, terrifying display of absolute military supremacy. The vast armada moved in an impenetrable, interlocking diamond formation, forming a spearhead of cold black iron and pulsing golden energy shields that spanned hundreds of miles across the dead cosmic zone. At the absolute vanguard of this formation were the siege dreadnoughts. These were colossal, city-sized vessels bristling with superheated thermal lances and kinetic bombardment arrays. War machines explicitly designed to turn continental plates into molten glass. Against this terrifying majesty, the human defense fleet looked like a scatter of pathetic metallic insects. Over 4,000 retrofitted asteroid mining vessels, rusted bulk cargo haulers, and patchwork engineering rigs drifted helplessly in the thick, particulate fog. They had no defensive energy shields. They had no military-grade ablative armor. They possessed absolutely nothing that could survive even a glancing blow from the Kalan main plasma guns. To any outside observer, this was not a battlefield. It was an execution chamber waiting for the order to fire. On the reinforced bridge of the Kalan flagship, Supreme Fleet Commander Vale stared at his advanced tactical holomap and let out a guttural, rattling hiss that served as laughter among his reptilian species. He had expected a desperate final stand, perhaps a suicidal charge from the human engineers, or even a cowardly, disorganized attempt to flee into the deeper dust storms. What he saw instead was bafflingly pathetic. The human vessels were not retreating, nor were they grouping together into a dense defensive cluster for mutual protection. Instead, under the silent, encrypted command of Asher Baird, the junkyard fleet was actively dispersing. They drifted outward, firing their maneuver thrusters just enough to spread into a massive, hollow ring encircling the central coordinates of the dead nebula. They were creating a perimeter, an incredibly thin and fragile circle of scrap metal, encompassing a vast, empty patch of dark space. "Is this their grand, terrifying strategy?" Commander Vial mocked, his voice echoing through the vast command deck as he addressed his bridge crew. "A single, stretched line of unshielded civilian garbage? They are trying to blockade the greatest armada in the galaxy with rusty mining drills and fuel barges, route all auxiliary power to our forward plasma batteries. Do not even bother calculating evasive maneuvers. Break their pathetic ring and incinerate everything in our forward path. We will sweep through them like a solar storm blowing through dead leaves." Following his command, the 10,000 Kalan dreadnoughts surged forward in perfect unison, their massive engine blocks flaring with terrifying intensity as they prepared to obliterate the fragile human defense line in one overwhelming, arrogant sweep. Aboard the command deck of the Aegis, Asher Baird watched the massive swarm of red hostility icons on his monitor accelerating directly toward his scattered, fragile line. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, sweat stinging his eyes. But his hands remained perfectly steady, hovering over the main console. He did not issue a panicked command to fire. There were no antimatter torpedoes to launch, no railguns to spool up. He simply watched, breathing in the stale, recycled air, waiting until the colossal, concentrated mass of the Kalan Armada crossed the invisible threshold he had meticulously calculated over the past 48 hours. They were moving exactly as he had predicted. They were now dead center in the middle of the human ring, suspended directly above the deepest gravity well of the Nebra expanse. "All civilian units," Asher whispered into the encrypted command channel, his voice a calm anchor, echoing in the cramped cockpits of 4,000 terrified human volunteers. "Link the network. Ignite the cores." Across the vast, dusty dark, 4,000 highly unstable gravitational cores roared to life at the exact same microsecond. But they were not aimed at the approaching alien warships. The human engineers had inverted the focusing lenses of their terraforming arrays. Instead of projecting localized gravity outward to crush rock, they turned the beams inward, chaining them together across the void. The invisible streams of immense localized mass collided and intertwined, forming an intricate, mathematically perfect geometric web of magnetic resonance. It was a macro-scale architectural masterpiece built from pure physics. They wove a net of raw gravity, an invisible, crushing cage that snapped shut around the entire Kalan armada. But trapping the fleet was not the true, devastating purpose of the web. The network of 4,000 roaring gravity cores acted as a colossal, cosmic magnifying glass, focusing all their combined, violently unstable kinetic energy directly downward, deep into the heart of the dead nebula below them. At the absolute center of the Nebra expanse lay a stellar corpse. It was a massive white dwarf, the burned-out, rapidly cooling cinder of an ancient star that had consumed its fuel and died billions of years ago. It was supposed to sleep in freezing, silent darkness until the end of time itself. But suddenly, it was violently, aggressively awakened. The artificial gravity web created by the human fleet acted like a massive pair of cosmic jumper cables thrust into its core. The concentrated, exponential pressure generated by 4,000 linked terraforming engines slammed into the dead star, compressing its inert atomic structure with unimaginable, agonizing force. The fundamental laws of physics screamed in protest. The dead core simply could not withstand the artificial compression. The dormant, heavy atomic elements were forcefully smashed together, completely bypassing the natural laws of stellar evolution. Within seconds, a forced thermonuclear fusion reaction ignited. Deep inside the nebula, a microscopic spark blossomed instantly into a blinding, terrifyingly pure white light. The dead star roared back to life, resurrected against its will, burning with a violent, unstable fury 1,000 times hotter and brighter than its original natural lifespan. The dark, violet clouds of the nebula were instantly illuminated from within, turning the entire cosmic sector into an ocean of blinding, radioactive fire. The Kalan Purge Armada was caught entirely off guard, suspended directly over the awakening giant. The sudden ignition of the forced stellar reaction created an immediate and catastrophic shift in the regional gravity. The newly birthed, raging star exerted a magnetic pull so absolute, so overwhelmingly violent, that the 10,000 Kalan warships were instantly paralyzed. Their advanced plasma engines screamed, pushing against the void with maximum thrust, draining their reactors to the absolute limit. But they did not move a single inch forward. They were tethered, locked completely in place by the inescapable gravitational anchor of a newborn sun. Warning sirens wailed continuously on the bridge of the Kalan flagship as their hyperdrive navigation systems completely failed. Supreme Commander Vel gripped his command console, his golden reptilian eyes wide with a profound, existential terror he had never before experienced. The ambient heat inside the heavily armored ships was rising exponentially by the second. Their golden energy shields were sparking, flickering, and rapidly failing under the immense, crushing wave of solar radiation. He looked desperately at the holographic map, finally realizing the horrifying, brutal brilliance of the human strategy. The humans were sitting safely on the outer rim of the gravitational blast radius, running their engines red-hot just to maintain the pressure, keeping the magnetic cage firmly locked. The Kalen were not fighting soldiers. They were not fighting a traditional navy. They had sailed straight into the mouth of a cosmic furnace. And the humans had just slammed the heavy iron door shut and cranked the heat to maximum. The chilling, paralyzing truth crashed over the Supreme Commander and his crew. The humans never intended to defeat them with lasers or kinetic bullets. They fully intended to forcibly detonate this entire section of space, perfectly willing to hold the door shut until everyone, hunters and prey alike, burned together in a shared, apocalyptic grave. Inside the command bridge of the Kalen flagship, the air turned into a suffocatingly hot soup. The forced thermonuclear fusion of the Nebra star was radiating a wave of cosmic heat that defied all advanced thermal dampeners. Across the 10,000 trapped warships, the golden energy shield shifted from a proud, pulsing glow to a sickly, unstable yellow, and finally to a desperate, flickering white. The internal temperature alarm shrieked a deafening chorus of impending doom. Bulkheads began to warp, groaning under the immense stress of a localized gravity well pulling them toward a fiery oblivion. The tactical display showed catastrophic system failures spreading across the fleet like a virus. The Great Purge Armada, the most feared military assembly in recorded history, had exactly 3 minutes of structural integrity remaining before their hulls liquefied and their crews were incinerated into atomic vapor. Supreme Fleet Commander Vale fell to his knees. The blistering heat was stripping away his golden scales, his ancient pride evaporating entirely in the face of absolute, inescapable death. He lunged toward the communication console, slamming his heavy claws onto the emergency broadcast channel. He transmitted an unencrypted, desperate plea for a ceasefire across all open frequencies. Aegis Command. This is Fleet Commander Vale. Halt the ignition sequence, I repeat. Halt the stellar ignition sequence. We concede the sector. Shut down your engines before we are all consumed. The response from the human fleet was a terrifying, heavy silence. The intense gravitational pressure did not waver for a single microsecond. The blinding light of the waking star continued to swell, bathing the human junkyard fleet on the outer rim in a glorious, terrifying halo. Finally, the communication line cracked open. Asher Bear did not appear on the visual feed. His voice simply echoed through the sweltering bridge of the Kalen flagship, calm, steady, and entirely devoid of mercy. I am not pausing the reaction. Commander, Asher stated, the words chilling the air more effectively than any cooling system. You brought 10,000 planet killers to my home. You threatened to burn my species to ash. I am simply showing you what a real fire looks like. If you want the heat turned off, you will accept my terms without a single modification. Vile gasped for air, watching another dreadnought on his monitor lose its shielding and instantly burst into a silent, expanding sphere of molten slag. Name your terms. Human. First, Asher dictated, his voice carrying the weight of a unified, stubborn species. Total and immediate withdrawal of all Kalen military forces from the human border. Second, a permanent, unbreakable weapons embargo on the entire Orion arm. No warships, no listening posts, no intelligence drones. If a single armed Kalen vessel crosses the threshold of our space ever again, we will not target your ships. We will systematically target the core of every star in your home system and burn your empire from the inside out. Transmit these terms to your high command. You have 60 seconds to secure their unconditional surrender. The channel went dead. Vile did not hesitate. He routed the ultimatum directly to the Kalen Supreme Council, appending the rapidly deteriorating telemetry of his dying fleet. The ancient and arrogant leaders of the Kalen Empire sat in their obsidian halls, watching their invincible armada melting in real time. They were faced with a horrific binary choice: They could preserve their pride and lose the core of their military power, leaving their empire defenseless against rival alien nations. Or they could bow down to the feral, terrifying engineers of Earth. With 15 seconds left before total structural collapse, the Supreme Council transmitted their official, legally binding surrender across the galactic network. They accepted every single condition unconditionally. The confirmation pinged on the primary console of the Aegis. Asher exhaled a long, heavy breath. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but his mind remained sharply focused. All civilian units. Asher broadcasted to his exhausted, terrified militia. The enemy has surrendered. Invert the magnetic resonance. Put the star back to sleep. Across the dark expanse, 4,000 human workers pulled their manual override levers. The artificial gravity web instantly reversed its polarity. The immense, crushing pressure on the white dwarf vanished. Deprived of the forced compression, the newborn thermonuclear reaction choked and starved. The blinding light rapidly dimmed, collapsing back into a smoldering, heavy red glow, and finally returning to the cold, silent dark of the dead nebula. The unbearable heat, radiating through the Kalan warships, instantly dissipated, leaving behind 10,000 heavily damaged, crippled dreadnoughts drifting helplessly in the void. The event reshaped the entire political landscape of the galaxy in a matter of minutes. The observing alien intelligence networks recorded everything. They realized a profound truth about humanity. The humans were not a bloodthirsty species looking for conquest. They did not want to rule the stars or subjugate other races. But their desperate, unyielding determination to protect their own, their absolute willingness to drag the entire universe into the fire with them, made them the most dangerous entities in the cosmos. On the reinforced observation deck of the Aegis, Asher Baird stood alone in the dim amber light. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking out through the thick quartz glass at the silent, humiliating retreat of the Kalan armada as they limped away toward the edge of the system. He watched the stars settle back into their peaceful, quiet, ancient rhythm. The human race had not fired a single traditional weapon, yet they had won the greatest war in history. They had spoken in fire, and the galaxy had finally learned to listen. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful listeners for tuning in to the end of this journey today. We would love to know where in the world you are listening to this story from, so please let us know in the comments below. As we mentioned at the beginning, our channel is facing tough times after losing YouTube monetization, and we rely entirely on the kindness of our incredible community. If you found today's story thrilling and want to help us keep the lights on, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen right now, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Every single dollar goes directly to paying our dedicated creative team, so they can feed their families and continue bringing you the best science fiction stories in the universe. Thank you for standing with us, and we will see you in the next adventure.